Hello, everybody. I am Rachel Smith, CEO of ExchangeWire, and I'm joined here today by Richard Ottoy, GM of EMEA, Sharethrough.
That's right.
How are you, Richard?
I'm very well.
That's good.
Thanks very much.
We are going to have a conversation about environmental sustainability and some key trends that we're seeing in and around sustainability in advertising and marketing. So let's dive straight in. I think it would be fair to say that 2022 was the year that we all learned quite a lot about the impact that digital advertising is having on carbon emissions and the role that the industry is playing in terms of environmental sustainability. But the first question that I had for you was around awareness. To what extent do you feel like the industry is really truly aware of the impact that we're having on carbon emissions? And do people really understand what the levers are, why digital advertising is so carbon heavy?
Yeah, I think this year, to your point, I think we've done a great job over the last sort of 12, 18 months in creating a better awareness of the impacts from digital advertising, right, and what that's having on the climate. But in terms of that knowledge gap, I think it's still a pretty sizable gap. So I think next year, more awareness and more knowledge will be created in the industry. We're, as an industry, being incredibly wasteful. So I think a lot of that has been sort of spoken about over the last few months. As an industry, actually as the internet, that is now contributing more CO2 than the aviation industry.
Which is shocking when you think about it.
Which is really scary. Yeah. I actually heard something recently that one email sent is the equivalent of one plastic bag in terms of the impact on the climate, which that's a really scary statistic. Now, we're not obviously going to get people to stop sending emails. That's never going to happen.
What a joy it would be if we did do that. Right. No, I don't mean it. But
right.
yeah, seeing it, when you think about it through that lens and you think about wastefulness, it would be really interesting to see what kind of behaviours this sort of awareness might lead to.
Yeah, absolutely. But we know that basically ads power the internet, right? So most of the emissions come from us delivering ads on websites. So in terms of us creating a much more efficient ecosystem, I think we need to tackle three core areas. So the first is around supply path emissions. Yep. So we're now at the point where when there's a user on a website and there's an ad opportunity to deliver an ad to that user, we're creating so many different supply paths, right? Hundreds, potentially thousands of different supply paths in order to try and monetize that user. And that's incredibly wasteful because it's not just the winning supply path and rendering that ad, it's all of those supply paths are going to be requiring energy. So we obviously need to tackle that, and I think the agencies, the DSPs and also the SSPs need to ensure that they're choosing the most efficient path through to that end user. The second area is publisher emissions. So I think publishers now, if they're not already, need to look at how their web pages are loading. And what's happening and kind of where they're being inefficient. So they can conduct audits to have a look at, have they got old pixels that have been on there for ages that are just redundant, that just obviously keep firing every time that web page loads, but it's just not necessary. So old analytics pixels or social widgets or whatever it might be. They could look at how they're actually calling their ads and loading the ads on the page. Are they utilising solutions like lazy loading and stuff like that? And actually, how many ads do they have on the page? How much video are they running? Stuff like that. So publishers need to start looking at those areas. And then the third area to tackle is creative emissions. So the brands and the agencies also need to play their part in optimizing those creatives, looking at things like file sizes. Even the colors of a creative will have an impact on the energy that's required to render that creative. So yeah, we need to tackle those three main areas.
I'm going to dive into a bit more detail in some of those areas in a minute, but the second part to that question I wanted to ask you as well is, to what extent do you think that the average consumer is aware of the digital footprint of digital advertising? Do you think that we're becoming more aware in a general sense of the amount of data, for example, that we're consuming and using and applying? Do you think there's any awareness at all out there about?
I think the awareness will be pretty low. I think consumers are generally becoming a lot more aware of the impact on the climate as a whole, but not necessarily around digital advertising. I think the extent of people's knowledge around the impact that digital advertising is having is, I don't know, probably the fact that their laptop requires electricity, and as a result of that, it's going to have sort of a small impact on the environment. But
Yeah.
I think that knowledge area is going to be pretty low.
Yeah, well, it will be really interesting to see what 2023 brings, right? Because obviously there'll be a lot more education out there in the market, just from the point of view of the changes, some of the changes that we're trying to bring about within the industry. But then you might start to see the connection, mightn't you, between the way that consumers are receiving ads and consuming ads. So they'll become even more aware of those ads that are loading really slowly or that are really lagging the page, and that might make them start thinking about those products and those brands and those advertisers from a different point of view, right? Yeah. Changing gears a little bit, a question about these fabulously ambitious goals that a lot of our partners in the advertising industry have got to sort of be embarking on from 2023 onwards, and that's trying to get to carbon neutral in 2030. To what extent do you think it's going to be important for the industry to be taking some collective responsibility of actions in order for us to get there? Because that's a pretty ambitious goal.
Right. Yeah, I think next year we'll see a lot more companies kind of start their own sustainability initiatives. We've obviously already seen that this year. We've got companies like WPP and Havas and IPG. They've already started their kind of journey towards being more efficient. So we're going to see more of that next year. And of course, it's going to start getting to the point where if companies want to continue to attract ad dollars, then they're going to have to start their own journey to becoming more sustainable, otherwise it's going to start affecting them. And the way that I think about it is probably not too dissimilar to the electric car market, right? We know that we need to get people out of combustion engine vehicles and over to electric vehicles, right? And so in order to do that, in order to accelerate that, you disincentivize people who have petrol cars. You push up the price of fuel, you push up road tax, you make it expensive to drive into city centres, all of those kind of things, whilst at the same time you incentivise electric car owners. So if you kind of take that concept and apply it to digital advertising, brands and agencies are the ones that ultimately control the ad spend. They're the ones that have got the power to persuade their downstream partners that they need to become more efficient, otherwise they risk losing out. So I think we'll probably start to see a lot more of that next year. Okay,
so partly connected to that, what about the concept of reporting on your carbon emission output and measuring it? So measuring and reporting. You know, we talk often about how you can't necessarily quantify a problem and really talk about actual actions unless you can measure it. And we've seen a number of initiatives come out into the market in 2022 to help people specifically in the advertising and marketing industry to measure their emissions. Where do you think we're heading around both measurement and reporting on those emissions in 2023? Because arguably some of that will start to drive some of the behaviour that you're talking about. Once people can actually see what type of emissions certain advertising formats are creating, it might inspire them to take different decisions, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think next year reporting is going to be hugely important. Yeah. We obviously now at the point where companies can measure on their carbon emissions. You've got companies like Scope 3 who are working with companies to sort of measure those emissions and their carbon footprint. You've now got coalitions like AdNet Zero. They're starting to create more industry-wide standardisation of the measurement and reporting of carbon emissions. And then also, of course, the holding companies, they're wanting to ensure that their partners are also becoming more efficient as well. So just, I think that natural sort of evolution, companies are going to have to start to become more efficient in order to sort of satisfy those that are spending, the agencies and things like that. So I think just naturally that is going to create more common sort of practices and standards around emission reporting. Yeah. And then what we'll also start to see a lot more next year, I think it started a little bit this year, but advertisers will start to bring in those emissions, the emissions data into kind of their workflows for how they plan and activate campaigns. So they will start to look at that emissions data to look at, these are kind of the environments that I've historically bought and run my campaigns within. And I'm going to start optimizing away from websites that are being wasteful and push more spend to those that are being more efficient. So we'll start to see that. But also for me, in terms of reporting, it's a hugely important area. Firstly, because obviously then companies can actually measure their emissions, but also it creates accountability. Because if a company is reporting on their emissions and they're being transparent about that to their customers, to their partners, then they're also going to have to take meaningful steps to reduce their emissions, right? because obviously people are now coming to expect that.
And like you said, they'll be held accountable, so it's not as though you can just continue reporting on your emissions and watch them gradually go up. You know, other stakeholders in the industry will be willing to actually call people out and bring companies and businesses to accounts. And I guess that's one of the big benefits of measuring and recording that kind of information. And it moves everybody beyond the world of pledging to do things to actually, needing to, attach real meaningful action plans to actually get somewhere. But there's a lot of really interesting threads on that, one of which is that you mentioned already, this is actually going to then therefore show up, who's buying carbon heavy media, and, can we be doing some things to reduce the carbon footprint of that media? Do you think there'll be other penalties baked into that? Do you think that certain media will become more expensive because it's carbon heavy, and that will then push publishers into an environment where they're thinking about how they can reduce those emissions?
Yeah, I think those penalties will come in the form of campaign performance.
Yeah.
If it becomes expensive to run in certain environments because those environments are wasteful, then the advertisers are just going to start moving spend away from them, because obviously they can't be seen to be advertising in those areas, but also obviously it's impacting those campaigns. So I think the penalties will come in those areas.
Yeah, interesting. Let's talk about supply path optimization. It, as we mentioned just before cameras started rolling, supply path optimization has been a key mechanism that players in the industry have been using to make the path to site more efficient and better quality. So what do you think is going to happen with respect to supply path optimization and environmental sustainability in 2023? Because there seems to be a key relationship between the two.
Yeah, absolutely. I think next year lots of companies will pay greater emphasis to their Scope 3 emissions, because Scope 3 emissions are typically the lion's share of your emissions as a company. It's probably over 90% for most companies. So as your emissions are obviously Scope 3 emissions, and you're responsible for them, but ultimately you don't control those emissions. So as the reporting company, you then have to try and persuade your partners, whether it's technology companies or publishers, to become more efficient. And if they won't, then obviously they're just going to start choosing companies that are. So I think that's kind of one area. And then if you think about SPO as a concept, right? It's about helping a company find the most direct and efficient path to a user. So if a company is actually using SPO as kind of a tactic and trying to find those most direct paths, naturally that's going to eliminate unnecessary hops in the supply chain, and then naturally that's going to remove unnecessary emissions. So I think SPO will play a really big part next year in how companies optimise their business and try and become more efficient.
And do you think that brands and agencies will be looking for SPO in the partners that they're using from both of those angles? So will they be looking at it from an environmental sustainability point of view as well as just a basic efficiency point of view?
Yeah, I think they'll be looking at what is that organisation doing within their own business to become more efficient. But then as an SSP, do we have direct paths to the publishers? Are we creating unnecessary emissions and sort of hops within our own marketplace? So I think they'll look at both of those channels. Yeah,
interesting. Finally, let's talk a little bit about greenwashing. So what do you think is going to happen with respect to greenwashing in 2023? We know that greenwashing has become the practice of making some, shall we say, sometimes exaggerated, slightly glorified statements about what you do and don't do with respect to environmental sustainability. Yeah. Many of the things we've already talked about obviously help to push people into an environment where they can't be relying on greenwashing principles, and instead they've actually got to put their money where their mouth is and state exactly what they're doing and how they're planning on making their products more sustainable or making their technology more sustainable. So what do you think is going to happen with respect to greenwashing in 2023?
Yeah, it's an interesting area, and obviously greenwashing is going to be something that companies are going to be really sensitive about. I think there's a fine line between greenwashing and sustainability, and that's transparency. We actually conducted some research at the start of the year which showed that consumers are now, a high percentage of consumers are now favouring brands that are actively working to reduce down their emissions. So consumers are becoming really aware of this and looking at brands to try and make a difference on our environment. But I don't think I don't think companies have to necessarily have kind of a fully laid out plan in terms of how they're going to get to net zero or whatever that might be, as long as they are being completely transparent to both consumers and partners around what they're trying to do to become more sustainable, reporting on things like wins and losses, then I think they could probably avoid accusations of greenwashing. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, and do you think that's actually going to encourage people to be a little bit more honest, certainly in their communications, but also in their conversations about what they're doing to tackle environmental sustainability, if they know that, in fact, it's more important to be talking about what you're doing and where the challenges are and admitting where some of the challenges are, rather than making grand statements that are hollow and meaningless?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a very, very difficult task of trying to become carbon neutral or net zero, whatever it is your sort of targets are over the next 5 or 6 years. So I think it would be unreasonable to kind of just say to people, oh, we're gonna be there in 5 years' time or whatever. So I think it would be natural to kind of say, oh, we tried in these areas and we failed, but we've made great gains in these areas. So again, as long as there's that transparency and you're being very honest about your efforts, then I think people would appreciate that. Yeah. And I think consumers would react to that as well.
Well, it certainly seems to be something that's super important to consumers, right? They're much more interested in the authenticity of the message. Even if the journey isn't necessarily straightforward, they want to be convinced by what it is that companies and businesses are doing, right, to contribute to environmental sustainability. And one final question on that: do you think that also many of the things that we've already talked about will help to encourage the principle of moving towards carbon neutral activity rather than carbon offsetting? So offsetting has been a really important step in the process for achieving some form of environmental sustainability, but of course it doesn't actually stop or slow the actions that are causing the carbon emissions. So do you think some of these things will help us push our focus much more towards neutrality rather than offsetting? Yeah,
again, because the lion's share of companies' emissions are Scope 3 emissions, there will be a greater emphasis on trying to reduce emissions rather than offset. But as I say, that's very difficult because you don't control those companies, you don't control those emissions. So I think there will be a lot of sort of collaboration next year, and how do we create that more efficient ecosystem? How do you choose the right partners to work with that's ultimately going to help your business? But as I say, it's very, very difficult because, the lion's share of Scope 3 emissions and you don't control them. And as I say, as a company, you don't have to have kind of this fully laid out plan. As long as you're actively trying to make sort of meaningful steps to improve your business, then I think that's going to help. And we've also now, since Q2, we've been running our green media products, which helps brands and agencies to reduce the emissions in their campaigns, so we can actually calculate and compensate for the carbon that's generated from the campaigns. So that's a good place to start.
Fantastic, certainly is. Great. Well, thank you very much, Richard. Thanks for coming to chat with me today.
Thank you very much.
Looking forward to catching up with you again later in 2023 to find out if some of these key trends have indeed become commonplace.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for watching.